Welcome to the Maritime Matters podcast. Did you know that 98% of Australia's trade passes through the maritime domain? 91% of its fuel is imported, and Australia's exclusive economic zone is larger than its mainland. It's easy to see that to Australia, maritime matters. Maritime Matters is the podcast where we break down what the week's events mean for Australia's maritime security and the wider Indo-Pacific. Hello, welcome to this episode of Maritime Matters. We're recording on the morning of the 26th of August. So if anything radical and exciting happens over the next 24 hours before this comes out, that's why we're not including it. Hi Jen, how are things with you? What have you been up to over the past week or so?
Too much. A few things that our viewers might be interested in. I've had a couple of pieces out. So I had a piece out in the Lowy's Interpreter talking about how we think about the concept of interoperability. One of my bugbears is this idea of these buzzwords that catch on, that actually, when they catch on, they become devoid of meaning and then we kind of lose what we're trying to achieve. I think that's kind of one of the things that's applied to the ideas of integrated deterrence, but also interoperability and increasingly maritime domain awareness. So you can check out my piece in Lowy's Interpreter. I also had a piece in The Strategist, had to do both sides of the defence blog sphere in Australia, talking about the Western Indian Ocean and saying, yes, as much as I acknowledge that the Eastern Indian Ocean, or specifically the Northeastern Indian Ocean, needs to be a primary focus for Australia. We still have dependencies in the Western Indian Ocean. Fuel is but one. And so highlighting that we can't just ignore the Western Indian Ocean. And coincidentally, by absolute accident, not design, it came out the day before Australia announced that they would take command of the Red Sea Task Force. So maybe somebody read my op-ed. But we can get into that a little bit more. And then finally, by the time this comes out, I'll have a piece in The Australian talking about the Australia-Indonesia relationship and that upgrade from an arrangement to an agreement that I kind of struggled with last podcast episode. So I've put some more coherent thoughts around that. So if you're interested, you can read that in The Australian on Tuesday, the whatever date tomorrow is, the 27th of August. Can you believe it's August, nearly September?
Wow, well, it does sound like you've been busy. Certainly compared to me. Anyway, moving on, we're going to talk a bit about some of the things that have been happening in the region, and you've already highlighted one of these, which is that Australia is to step up and take over command of the Red Sea Task Force, the Combined Maritime Forces, Combined Task Force 153. They're going to be taking over that in October. So this obviously fits into a narrative, as you were suggesting, you've been talking about for some time, about what is Australia's role in this region, what should they be doing, how can they potentially be doing more. And this comes at a time when there's been actually quite a lot again happening in the Red Sea over the past week or so. Particularly, there's a Greek oil tanker which was attacked repeatedly by Houthi rebel forces. I think it's called the Soyunion, and it's currently it's abandoned because the crew has abandoned it and it's floating abandoned in the Red Sea. So this real step up, I think, that we're seeing once again, or kind of, I guess it's more peaks and troughs, right, of this type of action in the Red Sea. And we've seen other bits and pieces coming out of further reports of Allied warships intercepting UAVs and USVs over the past week or so. So real sort of continued significant naval action taking place in the Red Sea. And this is coming at a time when Australia is set to be taking over the command of the task force as of October. I'm assuming you view this as a positive step. What's your take? Somebody who's been talking about this a lot, right?
I have. I do view this as a positive step. Now, in the Did You Know section at the end of this podcast, I'll give a little bit of spiel about the history of the Combined Maritime Forces and Australia's involvement. But I think it acknowledges that we do see issues to do with the Western Indian Ocean, then into the Red Sea, as impacting our national security. I think there's a big question mark over that around the time that the Houthis started attacking ships in November of 2023. and Australia was asked to send a warship. We sent some increased personnel, but some of the commentary around that, specifically from the current government, we wanted to focus more on our primary military area of interest. And from one sense, that's understandable, but I do think that there is a bit of a challenge to that when you think about issues of maritime strategy and how the maritime domain impacts Australia's national security. So I think it's positive. It is important to acknowledge that Coalition Task Force 153 oversees a bunch of maritime security activities in the Gulf of Aden and the Red Sea, one of which is Operation Prosperity Guardian, which is the defence of merchant shipping heading through the Red Sea. Now, we know there's not as much heading through the Red Sea as there was. Most of it is now going around the Cape of Good Hope and the Horn of Africa. There has been a bit of criticism, so a lot of skeptics, less so in Australia, but overseas have come out and kind of questioned how effective Operation Prosperity Guardian is, what they're actually doing. Are they doing convoys? How are they protecting ships? Where are they getting the assets from? And I think that they're all valid kind of discussion points and concerns. And this is always one of the challenges with something like Combined Maritime Forces, where it's kind of come as you are, give what you give. But either way, even with limited assets, and we'll get to the Australian assets conversation in a moment, I think there is still great benefit. One, the idea of having to command a task force in an operation that is dealing with such a significant threat and having to liaise with other countries, liaise with other operations, because we know that EU NAVFOR, Operation Asperities, is also operating there, and having to have that engagement with the shipping industry. I think that's all incredibly positive experience. Is Australia taking command going to have any influence on the outcome of that operation? No, that really comes down to assets and also some US strategic thinking. But I think there's lots of benefits. It also sends a message, so beyond the experience, it also sends a message that we do care about maritime trade. And I think that's an important message for Australia as an island nation to send. And then thirdly, it does back up the US in that area. And as much as there are 45 members of the Combined Maritime Forces, I suspect most of them are not supporting or having much to do with CTF 153. So in the broad, I think it's positive, but I do acknowledge the criticisms, and although they're valid, I think that on opportunity cost basis, we're going to get a lot out of this. Of course, there's been criticism that we're not sending a ship with them, and traditionally Australia has sent a ship when we have commanded coalition task forces, mainly to do with counter-narcotics and maritime terrorism. And we've kind of talked to death, I think, on this podcast about the pros and cons of sending ships or not sending ships. I'm actually lucky enough to be heading to Sydney tomorrow to brief RUSU New South Wales. So if you're in New South Wales and Sydney, you can come along about the ship challenges for the Australian Navy. And it is true to say that they are under a lot of pressure at the moment. I, of course, still think there is benefit, but I don't think it's one or the other. I don't think it's we have to send a ship with a command team. I just think that it's unfortunate that we're not. What's your take on sending a team to command the Coalition Task Force 153?
I mean, I think it fits into quite a long trend of Australian commitment to these kind of forces in this region. I do think, and as you say, we've been back and forth about this for some time. I think that the decision not to send a ship was probably the right one and remains the right one, given the very limited number of hulls available and the pressures elsewhere. And we were talking last week about the lack of a ship being sent to the cooperative maritime activity in the West Philippine Sea. But I think taking these kind of actions is absolutely the right kind of call. And as you say, the experience that's been gained from it, one of the things that is coming up repeatedly is that actually being part of a group that's having to engage with things like ballistic missile challenges, a wide range of different autonomous and uncrewed challenges. I think it's certainly something that we need to be engaging with these issues, and one of the best ways to do so is to be learning from what's happening on the spot, as you've made that case elsewhere. So yes, absolutely, makes a lot of sense to my mind. And whilst I have real reservations about the idea of naval forces being able to fix this problem, the Houthis are not going away anytime soon. This is going to remain a hugely important area as we will bang on about forevermore, in terms of maritime trade and everything else. So this is going to be something that needs to be done until we can find a way to better solve this problem, which is going to require politics and diplomacy realistically, because we're not going to solve it with pure military force. So this is something that needs doing. It's an important job, and Australia should be stepping up in this kind of way. What else has been happening in the region?
Lots, but I'm just going to make two other points on that.
Okay, yes.
Then we're going to move on from the Red Sea. I agree. We've been commanding, Australia has been commanding Coalition Task Force for a long time. Interestingly, though, not since 2020. So we have actually had a gap, which I think that if you went back and looked at the history, it would probably be the longest gap Australia commanding a Coalition Task Force in CMF since its inception. So there obviously was a decision to pull away. So last time we commanded, we had a ship. That was in 2020. We commanded CTF 150, which is the Counter-Narcotics Task Force. We had HMS Toowoomba there. Both of those came back home, and we actually didn't send any further command teams until this one. Traditionally, one was sent every 2 years. So I think it kind of highlights a refocus a little bit. And I think it's important because there's a couple of points I want to kind of draw out about this, whether it's a will they or won't they send a ship, that kind of conversation. I think there's two. I think one, we need to be careful about understanding our dependencies. And I'm firmly of the view that whilst the Middle East is not the most important issue for Australia, I think the maritime domain and the waters surrounding the Middle East for the foreseeable future will always matter to Australia. And I think that's something that potentially we had forgotten about. Now, maybe when we have different energy suppliers, we won't have to care about it. But right now, I think that we will. The US, for example, since 2018, the US has become an exporter of oil. So they are actually less dependent on the maritime domain in the Middle East, but we are still quite dependent. I think the second thing is this, will they, won't they send a ship? I think that it can't be emphasized enough that we are in a bit of a bind in Australia in terms of our maritime capability. And I think sometimes there's a tendency to gloss over it of, oh, well, that's okay. We don't have enough ships. We're a small navy. I think that's a dangerous way of glossing over some of our vulnerabilities and our ability to protect them. Yes, Australia is a small navy in terms of ships, the smallest it has been for a long time, but that's not by design. That wasn't an intentional decision that we are going to be a small navy. I think that's by a lack of decision making. And so I think it needs to be a lesson that is kind of reiterated for the future. And the interesting point, just a boring point in terms of statistics, I was going through the what's called the centenary of the Australian Defence Force or something like that. There's a book, it's volume 6 called Sources and Statistics. Don't read it unless you're boring enough to be doing a PhD. But
it's wonderful.
It's a great book. It actually
for us nerds, it's awesome.
I'm definitely not a nerd, but in it, I just have a PhD that I promised to do. But in it has a list of the the size of the Royal Australian Navy in terms of personnel figures throughout its history. And we're actually reaching the largest size, with the exception of World War II, where we went from 5,000 to about nearly 40,000. And then some periods in the 80s where we're about 16,500, verging to 17,500. So the Royal Australian Navy is 16,000 personnel. If it meets its trajectory, it'll be 20,000 personnel by 2040, or certainly that's the target that the previous government agreed to in 2022. So despite the fact that we say that we're a small navy and we have issues with ships, when we talk about issues with workforce, just from a numbers perspective, outside of World War II, the Royal Australian Navy is almost the largest it has historically been. And so I just think that's a really interesting fact when we talk about workforce. Anyway, moving on from those kind of couple of key points, what else is happening in the region, Richard?
So there's been a return to some of the tensions have flared up once again in the South China Sea between the Philippines and China. This was something that we saw about a couple of months ago. There was a lot of tension and lots of issues over Second Thomas Shoal. There was an agreement that was reached over Second Thomas Shoal. We don't know quite what's in that agreement, but their tensions seem to have been reduced slightly. But instead now there are flares elsewhere, particularly around Sabina Shoal. So only yesterday or overnight, there was a significant ramming incident in which a Philippines Coast Guard vessel was rammed by a number of I saw reports of both Coast Guard and PLAN vessels, which I thought was quite interesting. And again, lots of things like significant water cannoning and trying to target engines and trying to effectively disable, and they did successfully disable the Philippines vessel that was on a resupply mission to fishermen out the shoal. This fits into a trend. There was other incidents earlier in the week. There was also some dropping of flares from a Chinese jet in front of a Philippines patrol aircraft only was it last week. So a number of these kind of issues and incidents have now been kind of stacking up, and it does feel very much like as pressure is being released on one area, it's being ramped up elsewhere. So I think it's certainly something that's worth keeping an eye on, and it's always difficult to tell with these sorts of things, but it does feel distinctly orchestrated. But we can perhaps come back to that. I'm not sure. What's your take on all of this?
Yeah, look, I agree with you. And again, you've got to be careful not to read too much into these things. But there is a trend, right? So when the agreement was reached around Second Thomas Shoal, and as you rightly point out, we don't know what that agreement entails, but we do know that the last resupply went off without any kind of real intimidation. There was a hope that the reason the agreement was reached was because both sides could see that the degree of escalation could lead to something further, and that was unhelpful for both. Now, potentially with the flare-ups around Sabina Shoal, I'm starting to think that the agreement was reached on China's side anyway, because it was a way of putting that issue to bed and demonstrating that they were trying to resolve things. But I certainly don't think that it was in any way an indication that they intended to apply less pressure. And so we have seen these incidents. It's not the first time we've seen incidents around Sabina Shoal. There have been incidents before, but this does seem a little bit of a ramp up. The vessel in the last 24 hours that was significantly water cannon disabled is actually not even a Philippines Coast Guard vessel, not that that would be okay. It's actually a Department of Fisheries vessel or something like that. So I think that, it's very clear that China is trying to apply pressure on the Philippines. And, we mentioned in a couple of podcasts ago, in the absence of applying pressure on other countries, because there are other countries that are doing things that China would normally take exception to in the Spratly Islands, including Vietnam's island building, which there was a piece a couple of months ago in The War on the Rocks that talked about this from Zach Cooper and Greg Poling. So there is a point about applying pressure to the Philippines, and it's now shifted to Sabina Shoal. And Sabina Shoal is quite strategic in terms of the location, so it's about 75 nautical miles from Palawan Island, which is very much inside the Philippines' exclusive economic zone. It's also a low tide elevation under the 26th Arbitral Tribunal, so it doesn't generate a territorial sea or exclusive economic zone. But it's also about 35 nautical miles to the east of Second Thomas Shoal. So if you can secure Sabina Shoal, you can actually secure, or you can interrupt any attempts to resupply Second Thomas Shoal. And it's only about 100 nautical miles from Reed Bank, which is another contested area between China and the Philippines, and will become increasingly contested as the Philippines desperately needs to get other sources of energy resources for their northern island. So, look, it's something to watch, but I think that there's going to be more escalation in the vicinity of Sabina Shoal, and maybe what we're just seeing is a transfer of the pressure from Second Thomas Shoal to Sabina Shoal.
Certainly feels that way, doesn't it?
It does. It does.
What else has been going on in the region?
Look, I think there's a couple of other little points to note. We won't go into the detail here, but there has actually been a lot of PLA activity in and around the South China Sea and also Taiwan, probably a little bit higher than normal. Ian Ellis-Jones is a great person to follow on Twitter if you want to kind of track that. He tracks it daily. We might try and delve into that in the next version of the podcast, but cognizant of the time. The other thing too is Australia's Indo-Pacific Endeavour activity. I don't know what they call it these days. It's not an exercise. It's not an operation. Deployment has kicked off. It's not really clear exactly what's happening there. We do know that they have just visited Sri Lanka. There was some diplomatic engagement and certainly some law of the sea teaching. It's great. And we do know that they're also going to be heading to Indonesia to do a major joint amphibious exercise in Indonesia, which I think will be quite historic. I think it's the first time we've done a bilateral joint exercise of that nature. And I suspect it's timed pretty well to come after the signing of the Defence Cooperation Agreement that we discussed. That there was a bit of fanfare about that last week in Australia, that the negotiations had completed and it would be signed imminently when the Deputy Prime Minister heads to Indonesia, whenever that will be, hopefully after my op-ed about it comes out. Any comments on Indo-Pacific Endeavour? You haven't been on an Indo-Pacific Endeavour, Richard.
No,
I thought you had.
I keep getting invited, and I keep not being able to for various generally teaching-related, rather dull reasons. So no, but I didn't get invited this year, so I don't know what's going on.
Oh, wow.
Maybe I've turned them down once too many times, and I'm on the blackballed list. But we'll see.
Maybe. Well, I didn't get invited either, but I was an executive officer for the first two Indo-Pacific endeavours in 2017 and 2018. But also, some other things happening. So HMAS Broome is in Broome. She's about to decommission. So one of the Anzac class. Armidale, they're also decommissioning. Armidale class patrol boats is on its way out as part of that transition to the Evolved Cape class. What else is happening in the region, Richard?
So in terms of capability, there was quite a significant announcement that got quite a lot of press this week, which was the announcement that Kongsberg are going to be building a factory in Newcastle to be manufacturing the Naval Strike Missile. So this was part of the wider Guided Weapons and Explosive Ordnance Enterprise project, under which the Australian government is trying to effectively build up our defence industry, and particularly in terms of manufacturing of munitions. This is, I think, one of the first really big kind of announcements, and certainly the big announcement with anyone outside of an American firm. So it's a Norwegian firm. They make this, it's a relatively new, I say that it's not that new, it's about 10, 12, 15 years old now, but new certainly to Australia. HMAS Sydney fired it for the first time at RIMPAC only a few weeks ago. But it's a new naval strike missile. So it's a really important kind of and quite advanced capability. There is also a joint strike missile, which is at least potentially an air-launched version of the same kind of thing. So the new factory will be able to build both of them. I understand it's the first factory that can do both outside of Norway, and the government is putting in $850 million to support this investment. So we've been kind of talking about the need to actually sort of put the money where the mouth is and get some results out of GUIO for some time. And I think this is a really significant kind of step.
Agree. I was lucky enough to be on Newcastle local radio news this week as a first, talking about this.
That's true celebrity, that is.
Yeah, Newcastle. Well, it's one step up from the Broken Hill local radio news, which I've been on a few times. Shout out to those from Broken Hill, my hometown. But no, I think this is great news. Certainly, I had a piece in the Fin Review recently talking about Osman, and one of the things I'd highlighted is it's great that we're going to be building GMLRS for the Army in Australia, but if we want to increase magazine depth, we need to get after some of the real missiles to support the Air Force and the Navy. So it's good to see we are. It's probably not really a surprise. I mean, this was kind of one of the benefits, I think, of going with NSM. Norway is a lot more flexible in terms of allowing these things. Obviously, we have some challenges with the US. It would be great to be building SM2s and SM6s, for example, in Australia, and hopefully that will happen, but certainly not on the horizon anytime soon. So look, very, very positive. Really think that NSM has been a good news story for the Australian Defence Force. You know, you mentioned that Sydney fired at RIMPAC. Actually, just a little fact, he said about 10 years ago, the first NSM was actually fired by Norway, in 2013. I think at a RIMPAC, but either way, 11 years ago. So I think it's good we're on this train. I saw a lot of debate last week where people saying, well, what about things like Maritime LRASM and stuff like that would have a longer range than the Naval Strike Missile? Well, the fact is that those capabilities are not operational, and we need a capability right now. So, yeah, good news story. What else is happening in capability? We haven't spoken about AUKUS yet. There's going to be something happening in AUKUS.
So there is. This is the announcement that the first US submarine that's going to be going through a maintenance period in Australia. This is a submarine tender maintenance period. So it's I guess, to be fair, relatively low-level type maintenance of the USS Hawaii, and it's going to be taking place at HMAS Sterling, and it's going to be done jointly by sort of with obviously American personnel, but with Australian personnel embedded in it. And this is a really important part of the step up in terms of skills, understanding, workforce, leading towards initially SURF West, so Submarine Rotational Force West, but then obviously beyond that to the discussion that is always being talked about Australia being sovereign ready for its acquisition of 3 to 5 Virginia-class submarines, or certainly 3 in the 2030s. So again, lots of discussion about AUKUS back and forth, lots of newspaper articles and large amounts of ink spilt. But in terms of the actual steps that are happening, there's been a lot of things that have been ticked off. The American submarine tender has been doing the rounds for quite some time now in Australian waters, and has had Australian personnel on board for throughout that period. This is again the kind of the next step up in that, and I think we're going to continue to see these sort of milestones ticked off. Now, as we always say, this doesn't mean that everything's going to work fine into the future, but it's worth keeping note of these things, if only to keep some of the negative stories in balance.
Yeah, it's fascinating, really, how the AUKUS debate kind of goes on in Australia. Some people debate that it's not been debated, but it's certainly the most debated capability acquisition in Australia that I've heard of in recent history. I'm sure we could find a historical reference to something else. Maybe the fleet unit that came through Sydney Heads in 1913 or something like that. But it is the most debated and the most polarizing, right? Like in some ways, AUKUS has become less a capability, more an ideology for some, which is a really, really odd approach. But I think, you can't deny the facts that in terms of the submarine optimal pathway that was announced early last year, the AUKUS announcement itself in 2021, it is hitting most of its major milestones. And this is another example, this submarine tender maintenance period, where we have Australian Navy sailors conducting maintenance on a US nuclear-powered submarine in Australia. And it's not just the conduct of the maintenance. The press release talks about the fact that they'll be doing nuclear safety exercises, bringing in industry, I'm assuming also probably emergency services. So I think that's all positive. In terms of the nature of the maintenance, it's not entirely clear in the press release. The Australian Defence magazine has reported that it involves the reinstallation of an antenna, replacement of an important hydraulic valve. I'm sure all the hydraulic valves are important, and inspections of the hull by divers. I'm not sure where they got that from, to be honest. But either way, look, it is low-level maintenance, but still, I think the point is that when you do this low-level maintenance on a nuclear-powered submarine, the safety regulations that you need to meet are quite different. So I think it's a great experience. I think that the crunch point for is AUKUS remaining exactly on track will probably occur next year when we start to see how the infrastructure at HMAS Sterling is going to support the delivery, also the start of Submarine Rotation Force West in 2027. There's quite a tight period. But even then, if that isn't on track, there are ways to mitigate that, which is the use of submarine tenders, which is what we're seeing now. So, I think it's a pretty good news story. Also on AUKUS, UK are doing a review. They've announced a review into AUKUS. Which some people have interpreted they're looking at pulling out, but actually when you read the review, so they've appointed one of its most senior security bureaucrats, apparently, to review the progress and benefits of AUKUS. It looks like they're more looking at how do they leverage getting more out of AUKUS for their economy rather than reviewing any decision-making. Got any other kind of comments on AUKUS, everybody's favourite topic?
No, I think that I think we've covered it. I think that the UK story is to a degree a little bit of a non-story. There's definitely the new Labour government is interested in more widely trying to get a handle on what's going on in defence, and I think good reason that there's some concerns there. But this is just one part of that, and I can't see any particular legs in the kind of vague narrative that was being put around that this is sort of people questioning whether or not the UK's commitment is there. There's certainly been nothing coming out of the new defence minister to suggest that there's any kind of room between Australia and the UK on this at all. So I can't see any legs in. Yep. So for this week, we're going to return to our Did You Know series, and feeding off what we were talking about earlier about the Red Sea. Jen's going to be talking a little bit about what the Combined Maritime Forces actually are.
Yeah, so look, I think the Combined Maritime Forces is a really interesting construct. It has lots of benefits. It has a few negatives too. The larger a construct becomes from a military standpoint, the more unwieldy it becomes, and at times the less operational effective it becomes. But the Combined Maritime Forces was established in the early 2000s, so 2001, following the September 11 attacks and concerns around maritime terrorism in the region. And so it was founded by 12 countries in the Middle East. Australia was one of the founding members. And ideally, it was kind of focused on countering maritime terrorism in the Persian Gulf. That expanded over the years, as did the number of countries that are participating, to look at issues to deal with a lot of non-traditional maritime security issues, so narcotic smuggling, weapons smuggling. In the rise in piracy in the Western Indian Ocean, it then expanded to a counter-piracy task force, which brought in a whole bunch of other countries. And then over the years, it's kind of ebbed and flowed in terms of its focus. Right now, it kind of consists of 45 nations. Now, that is a pretty rapid expansion. So 12 at its beginning. In 2022, it was 38 nations, and there was a lot of excitement about India joining as a partner. Now it's at 45 nations. Now, some of those countries don't necessarily provide personnel or capabilities. Some of those memberships appear to be dormant. But most of those countries do at least provide some people into the headquarters. So I think it's quite a interesting mix of personnel. The headquarters for the Combined Maritime Forces is based in Bahrain, where the co-located with the US 5th Fleet headquarters, and it is commanded by the commander of the US 5th Fleet and NAVCENT, which is the US 3-star there. The Deputy Commander for the Combined Maritime Forces is always the UK 1-star in country, because the UK also has a Maritime Operations Centre, UKMCC, based out of Bahrain. Interestingly, the third in command, the Director of Operations, has always historically been an Australian, which I think is a little bit interesting fact. I was lucky enough to do that job many years ago. In terms of the remit, it looks after about 3.2 million square miles of water, which is a fair bit, including the Persian Gulf, the Gulf of Oman, all the way down to the Seychelles, the Gulf of Aden, all the way into the Red Sea. And it does that through 5 different task forces. So 150, we mentioned earlier in the show that Coalition Task Force 150 was previously commanded on a number of occasions by Australia, last in 2020, and it deals predominantly with counter-smuggling operations in the Gulf of Oman. Mostly counter-narcotics, sometimes counter-weapons. Coalition Task Force 151 is that counter-piracy task force we mentioned. A number of countries support only the counter-piracy stuff. That really had its heyday kind of 2008 through to 2014, but of course with the resurgence of piracy in late 2023, it's been a little bit busy. Interestingly, from our region, some of the biggest supporters to Coalition Task Force 151, the counter-piracy task force, is Japan and the Republic of Korea, who consistently have ships operating over there. Coalition Task Force 152 is the regional task force. It exists in the Persian Gulf and is always commanded by a regional task force commander. Always commanded now. In the early days of 152, when that was kind of the extent of CMF, Australia actually commanded 152 based on, located on some Iraqi oil platforms during the Gulf War. The new Coalition Task Forces 153 we've kind of done to death, established in 2022 to deal with maritime security in the Gulf of Aden and also in the Red Sea, and now looks after Operation Prosperity Guardian. And then finally, in 2023, there was the 5th Coalition Task Force established, which is 154, which deals with kind of capability development or capability enhancement or capacity building, however you want to talk about it, in the region. Helping some regional countries kind of build up their Coast Guard skill sets with things like maritime interception operations. So I think it's important to note that despite the fact that the Combined Maritime Forces had a resurgence in Australian media recently and a refocus with Australia deploying personnel to command the Coalition Task Force 153, we do actually have a long history with the Combined Maritime Forces as a founding member. And I think it goes to the point that I made earlier in the show that I think certainly for the near term, whilst we remain dependent on fuel supplies, that the Middle East will always kind of matter to Australia. And I think sometimes strategically we've made a mistake of thinking that the reason we were involved in maritime operations in the Middle East is the same reason we're involved in land operations in the Middle East. But I think they are two different strategic reasons. Anyway, that's a did you know? A quick canter through the 23-year history of the Combined Maritime Forces.
Excellent.
Did you know that, Richard?
I knew bits and pieces, but lots of new information in there, and I'm loving looking at the list of countries involved. I'm not sure what Albania's brought to it, but I'll maybe do some digging.
Interestingly, Albania also joined the International Maritime Security Construct, which is now in abeyance, but was stood up in 2020, which Australia was a founding member of to protect the Strait of Hormuz. So, not sure, but hey.
Why not?
Yeah.
Happy to have them aboard. On that note, I think we've done all we've got time for. So all I think is left to do is, as ever, say that this week, past few weeks, maritime has very much mattered, and will continue to do so. Thanks a lot, Jen.
Thanks, Richard. Maritime does matter.